Chapter of the Flexible Space Association, and thank you for joining us for our second webinar of the day. Today should have been the Flexible Space Association's annual conference and exhibition in London, and sadly that's now on hold for this week next year. So put that into your diaries now. And I'm joined for this by two people from some of our longer standing and active members of the Flexible Space Association. We have John Williams, who is head of marketing at Instant Group and a property marketing expert who's worked with several leading brands and has experience in the commercial and residential sector. And Will Kinnear, who started GKRE with Douglas Green in 2013 and has worked in the sector for over 15 years and acquired over 600,000 square feet of new sites. They will be happy to take questions from you. The chat function is open, so please do use that. And I will now hand over to John and Will to take us through. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks for everyone joining us today. I think most questions should be about Will's kind of roundhead, cavalier-esque moustache and beard combination, which is looking strong. Anyway, so Will and I came together about 6 months ago because we were telling similar stories around demand in the market, where we could see demand coming from, and how we felt that the operator model was going to need to adapt. So how we're going to need to push the type of space offered to clients, where that demand was coming from, and then how the operator model and landlord's supply would have to interconnect. We published that, we put that into a paper, which we intended to publish in March, just ahead of the FSA, and were to present upon it. And then obviously the world changed overnight. However, we believe, having surveyed a lot of operators and a lot of clients over the last few weeks, that it's still pertinent today that we can get into some of the topics we meant to look at. So we're going to look today at market demand, both pre and during COVID, and then take a future view as to where we think it can go. We're going to look at locality and the regional market, because I think there's a might call it a consensus in the market world that clients are looking to the regions, and that demand will have to go there, and the operating model may well have to adapt to cater for that demand. Verbatim, I've got some quotes from clients to introduce into the mix, looking at corporate clients and larger demand, which seem to be driving a lot of the market. What are the attributes they're looking for, and how do they predict the future of the sector? Also, some work that the Instant team have done around hygiene and office safety. We've spoken to a lot of operators. If you guys, as I'm sure you do, want to discuss that, to look at some of the issues around how to get people back to work. And then Will get into the model, how it needs to adapt, what operators are saying and owners are saying, and basically a best practice session to which I hope you'll all ask questions and we can turn it into more of a conversation. And then we'll wrap up with some predictions, again, hopefully fueled by the chat function on the app. Will, anything to add to that, barring the fact that the first piece of chat does mention your beard?
Thanks. Yeah, no, thank you, John. Thank you, Richard, as well for the comment. Yes, do apologise for the it's more of a sponsored thing with the children before they go back to school. I'm also donning a sort of 80s, late 80s, early 90s haircut, so I do apologise for that as well. But no, not really. I think we've got a data piece here where you've got your side of things in terms of what you've seen, what you've managed to ascertain from operators, and then there's the way we can take these things forward. Okay, so I'm going to crack on, but I'd love to answer questions and to keep this as interactive and as conversational as possible. So Will's going to join in on our slides, and I will stop to ask any specific questions as we see them. I won't dwell on this. Hopefully you know who we are. If not, we'll send the presentation to you guys afterwards so you can clarify some of those points. But this was our demand view of the market pre, post, and then where we're at in the lockdown. No massive surprises there. You can see exactly what happened. But a few points which I thought are critical to draw out is the UK, from our view, has had the biggest detrimental impact on demand and the slowest to recover. Now, thinking this through around the practicalities of lockdown and where Europe is, again, it's not that surprising. Spain and Italy, other countries like the Netherlands and Denmark, they're further down the road than we are. We're still really waiting for a bit more clarification from the government around some slightly woolly messaging.
So it's not entirely surprising. What is odd, though, is that the US has stood up so well during what has been a difficult time. The US was slower for demand to decrease. US demand was still very strong well into March. Part of me thinks it's a sheer issue of geography. I think a lot of companies were looking at their BCP processes and went to FlexSpace as an immediate reaction to keep their teams up and running. And FlexSpace was the best way to do that. So the demand didn't really tailor off, but it sprung back really quickly. The other consideration in that is also that a lot of American spaces stayed open throughout lockdown and were operating at anywhere as much as 30 or 40% of capacity, even though the restrictions of lockdown were in place, which is quite surprising. So this is a slightly more detailed view of demand, and it's hard to gauge how granular the audience wants me to go, but again, there are some few key points here to draw out. Is you can see the depth of how negatively UK demand was hit. So in those first few weeks, 4 weeks ago, demand was lower than 60%. It's crept back slowly. So we're starting to see demand come back to normal levels, which is 0% on the chart. But you can see that the USA was just much less impacted from a demand perspective than the UK. Similarly, Hong Kong, remarkably, I think as a city, as a nation, it's been less impacted overall by lockdown and has returned to work a lot more quickly. In fact, we've opened our office in Hong Kong as instant this week. But even during the crisis, it didn't really seem to dent demand that much. They carried on making inquiries. Viewings were problematic, but the market pushed on regardless. So that's actually quietened a lot of people in that market who were heralding the end of Flex Workspace. And we can see how quickly it's bounced back. The Netherlands was one of the most progressive countries in Europe in terms of lockdown, the speed at which it did so, and the speed at which it's come out of this. And again, you can see demand hasn't been that negatively impacted. Same with Germany, and they're starting to return to something you might call normality. So hopefully this is where we see the UK coming in coming weeks. We're feeding into Jane and the FSA all the time around data and demand and trying to keep them posted, because obviously it's a key concern and you want to marry this data up against ours. We have checked with other sites. I was interested to note that EGPL, that's EG Property Link, noticed that viewings this week and last were up 40% since the new lockdown measures came into force. So maybe for the commercial property and flex space, it does look like something approaching a V-shaped recovery, because there is pent-up demand in the market, and it will hopefully spring back if other countries and markets are to be viewed. Will, anything to add to that?
No, I think it's obviously it's intriguing to see it, and I think Germany's a very good pointer at the moment. You can see on China's figures, I think are one of the more interesting ones in terms of the positive correlation there a couple of weeks ago, as opposed to last week where we saw some more breakouts. I don't know whether that's linked or whatever else, but I think if the UK is going to follow this curve or this line, that clearly we've been severely impacted. I think the demand is bound to increase and will no doubt increase. I think it's not just in terms of previous levels. I think we're going to be looking at something, and people we've been speaking to, especially both on the property owner side and operator side. I think we're going to be seeing growth way above where we saw demand previously, especially where if you've got companies like Barclays stating that a building of 7,000 people, or notion of having 7,000 people in one building is a thing of the past. They're not alone. I think once that's understood by companies and by CRE around the world, I think growth in the flex space and space as service sector is going to go through the roof. We know that operators, and I think there'll be a lot of operators on here as attendees, have seen immediate pressures put on their business and on their models. Something that we're going to see coming out of the back of this in terms of the post-COVID or even the during COVID period, where we've got social distancing being put into place. So I think it's, from that point of view, I think whilst demand will no doubt increase on its natural level on previous figures, I think you're going to see some exponential growth. But what is key, I think people have got to remember, this is something that we've always talked about. GKRE especially, when we speak to people, is that we always claimed that the flexible workspace market was recession-proof. And we went through 2008. It was a very immature market then. UK was still ahead of the curve in terms of the world. But if you think about the retention levels, the income levels that operators have seen. And we've spoken to operators in central London and all around the UK. We are UK specific on that basis. We've been seeing occupancy to retention levels of anywhere between 45 and 85% in cities and in rural areas, in regional areas. So from that point of view, there is income coming in. I know operators are being squeezed, as I said, but there is income coming into operators. But what we are seeing, conversely, is obviously with building owners, where they've got tenants that are struggling and they've got individual tenants or single tenants in one building, and those tenants aren't paying any rent or service charge in some cases as well, there's massive pressures on them. So again, it's going to be really interesting to see how it all comes out the back end and how it really sort of works. But I think it's, I think key here is that we are, these figures do show that there is a curve going back up or a line going back up.
Exactly that. I'll just get into this slide in a second, but on our own webinar we did a couple of weeks back, and apologies for any repetition to listeners, but they also made one of the strongest points I've heard so far, which is that that the property market and further afield is looking at our sector now and seeing how we play this out. They want to see the sustainability of the model. They want to see how we as professionals, as operators within the market behave, about how we treat our customers, about how we discuss rent and returns with landlords. And maybe we can go into this in more detail later, but I thought it's very true. There is scrutiny on us as a sector, and they really want to see whether the market will bounce back. I mean, a few of them have already been pronouncing that things will return to normal, which is leases and the conventional sense. So this slide's actually a little bit out of date for reasons I'm going to go into in a second. So Google search demand for co-working is something we've always reported on, partly because it tells such a good story about the sector, and again about the multitude of sins which co-working bundles everything up into. And co-working demand has gone up and up and up. Demand and for searches for WeWork has gone up and up and up on Google. And then interestingly, we ran this data again last week, and co-working searches have now started dropping. And they have done so for the last few weeks, and they've done so across the UK, US, even globally. Co-working search terms have come down for the first time that we can see for 5 years. They haven't dropped away below the median here, but they have decreased and definitely decelerated. I wouldn't want to speculate, but whether this is a comment or a statement upon co-working specifically and shared workspace or similar is something to be debated. But it is telling that the numbers look to be flattening a little bit, albeit have recovered a little bit over the last couple of days. Conversely, searches for office space have remained quite consistent. So the broader I'm looking for office search demand has remained, whereas co-working has come back a bit. So that remains to be seen how, if at all, that plays out into Flex Workspace. Our clients, our consumers becoming better informed, more knowledgeable about what they're going to procure. I would say from instance client space, that's definitely the case, that clients are becoming more experienced in asking for specifically what they want and having more specificity around their inquiry type. And they're less kind of just asking randomly for co-working space and then trying to sign a lease, because that's what used to happen 2 or 3 years ago when I first joined the market. That all seems to have changed. So we're going to keep a close eye on that for now.
I think just jumping in there, I think key what we've been talking about is operators understanding what model they provide, what actual product they provide in the marketplace, and that's particular to each asset and particular to each operator themselves. I think you talk about specific searches. I think that general search parameters that have been used in the past will be dying out, and people will understand exactly what they're looking for, and therefore operators will become more important in terms of the product they're providing, the service they're providing, the hospitality they're providing, because tenants will become more discerning themselves on what they require and will know up front almost what they require.
Absolutely. So, and hopefully we'll draw this out within the presentation, but the trend that really drove a lot of our thinking in the paper that we've written together is around this idea of supply matching demand and regional supply in particular. Because what we saw aggressively last year, and which we were also seeing at the beginning of this year before lockdown occurred, was really the diversification of search away from CBDs and away from central locations. Now, this has been written about subsequently, and there's been a fair degree of commentary in the mainstream press, the CRE press around this. But we are seeing it definitively, and we are seeing it with larger clients looking for flex space certainly on a non-lease basis, And all over Europe, the US and UK, they were starting to look for different locations in a way that we hadn't seen before. So we end up doing space as a service deals down on the South Coast, some in Bristol. Birmingham, Manchester have been hot for 2 or 3 years now because of HS2. Glasgow came back. And it wasn't just regional cities. It started to be the suburbs around regional cities. And that demand was really, the word we kept on hearing from clients, corporate clients, was they wanted choice. They wanted choice as to where staff were going to work. They wanted different options. They had their central locations. They had quite a bit of flex space. And as they were becoming more sophisticated, they needed to provide different options in the marketplace for their clients. We've got some more research on this in a second in the slides coming up, but I would definitely, when I looked at this data again, during lockdown, I would say that this trend is going to accelerate. Nearly every corporate client I've interviewed has discussed the options around work near home, which is being used as a term. If not work near home, they're looking at a hub and spoke model. They are starting to sound out this idea of different ways of working and different modes of working. They want that space and they want it quickly. And we've even seen some of that demand dripping into the Asia Pac and the Australian market already. As Australia comes out of the lockdown, we've seen those inquiries coming into the marketplace really quickly from legal firms, management consultants, trying to procure quite large chunks of flex space, so 50 desks plus, to fulfill that demand of offering their workforce more choice. So next slide. I'll skip through market penetration because it's not quite relevant just for now, but I'll return to it in a second. In the UK, we could see that. So we already saw, as I mentioned, that demand in the key second cities, particularly along the HS2 line. But then that really started to diversify at the end of last year. And one of the most telling moments we had was when we went to Dublin to present our webinar there and to present research. And it was so interesting to hear the same commonalities coming out in Dublin as we'd heard in Manchester, Glasgow, even a presentation in Paris, whereby in those markets, whereby there were very low vacancy rates in the CBD, it was very hard for more supply of flex space on the basis that rents were so high. It was very, very difficult to make the model stand up. Client demand remained aggressive, but client demand for bigger space, more bigger space came out. And so I revisited those slides we looked at in Dublin and could see the kind of the trend here borne out. Again, Dublin, as it goes, has quite a diverse operator share. It's not quite as independent as somewhere like London or others. There are quite a few big players who tend to dominate supply. But the issue they face is the quality of the office stock. So the CBD in Dublin is very small. The office community come together to a very small part of the city. There isn't a diversity of choice. There certainly aren't offices with the right footprint to provide larger corporate spaces. And then in the webinar that we presented, and this was in early March, there were quite a few landlords in the room, and already they were saying, well, look, we're out in other locations like Sandyford. We're getting inquiries proactively about flex space. We don't know what the market looks like, but we know we need to provide options to our clients because we can see the demand. We're just not sure what it looks like. Who is going to work with us to try and produce this space? And they also had the issue in Dublin whereby for the good space in the CBDs, it was very pricey. The numbers were quite aggressive and quite competitive for a corporate to step in and make a 25 plus, 50 plus desk requirement, or there simply wasn't even the space available. So it was a very different, it was a very interesting conversation to have, and a very different conversation where the room was full of agents, landlords, some of the pre-existing operators and ourselves. And it turned into a bit of a conversation around how can we create better market supply that really resonates with clients. And we were in the market looking for 3 or 4 large corporates who were all flocking to Dublin because of the ICT rush there, because of Facebook and Google and everyone basing themselves in the Dublin market. So it had all the right hallmarks of being just the right kind of place whereby we should try and push a different operator, a different market supply profile. And looking at this slide here, you can see that among the occupier demand, a very large proportion of it was for larger space, which is interesting. So 0 to 2 desks and 0 to 4 dominate so many markets and is really the driver of demand. This is based on a slightly smaller pool of data, but run over a couple of years, you can see that larger requirements are really a key part of a lot of Dublin supply, and so a lot of Dublin demand. Well, does that resonate with things that you've been seeing in the market?
Definitely, I think it's key. What is going to be interesting out the back of this, and again, you've got the data there, but I think it's you know, as we saw coming out of 2008, the rise in SMEs and growth in SMEs was massive, and there's no reason to doubt why this shouldn't be the same again this time round, especially given the unemployment levels going up that have been announced today. And I think in terms of the way people work and how it's going to exist side by side, I think it's, you know, it's going to be key. You're going to have that corporate larger requirement that's ultimately you at Instant for one have been providing to, and some operators have been providing, but also you're going to find these small SMEs, and I think it's going to be very interesting how people and SMEs view workspace. One thing that we have been talking about is there's going to be a limited amount of people that are going to walk into a large 10,000, 20,000 square foot floor plate that's not fitted out for their own staff. If it's a larger operator that's got a large chunk of space that doesn't feel to the occupier that they're getting safety, they're feeling safe in that workplace, given what's going on in the short term. So I think what we are looking at is potentially a bit more boutique-y sort of operations, and also boutique-y operations within larger operations as well. I think that's going to be key to making people feel that they are safe. But I think regionally, and moving on to the sort of regional side of things, it's something that we've been talking about with a lot of owners that have actually, we feel that there's could be a strong demand from working near home. Working from home, we've all shown that actually businesses and corporates have understood that actually some of their staff can work from home, can work remotely, and therefore the ability to do so will continue on, and therefore real estate strategies will change. But I think in the short to medium term especially, you're going to see definite regional growth and demand, but this is not just regions like the Manchesters, the Birminghams, the Bristol, the thing where you were talking about in terms of Dublin. I'm talking smaller towns, even sort of market towns, where local employees will think to themselves, well, actually, you know what? I don't want to go into a town. I don't want to travel in, have poor parking, expensive parking, etc. Why not work somewhere nearer to home that actually I can get all the benefits? I could cycle there, I could walk there, and be in the position that they get all the benefits of workspace within close to their house, but also understanding the model has changed. Those days of, and I'm taking it to the extreme, but let's look at farmyards where a lot of people took dairy farm and changed their dairy farm into a 3 or 4 offices. Well, they were very cellular offices, very there was no community there. People go to work there and leave. I'm talking about more community. I'm not talking about necessarily people being closer, but I think people won't want to work from home. They won't necessarily want to travel in the short term, and therefore, if you can open up those doors to regional hubs where even around a city. So let's take London, for example. If you look at Fulham, Chelsea, Barnes, Hammersmith, wherever like that, you can see areas around the cities where people will want to live and work near there. And we're going to see, if you take the next step on to market towns and towns and smaller cities, you're going to see what I hope is something we've also seen before this, was a blend of uses with retail, leisure, offices all working alongside each other on the high street or wherever else. I mean, we're not saying it's going to save the high street, but I think the diversification of product will allow people to work in an area that they think to themselves, hold on, this is local to me. I feel safe because I'm able to work in these environments that I've known all my life. But I think it's going to bring a whole change of dynamic. And we have seen this. We've been working with a number of landlords pre-COVID and more since, actually, where we're looking at shopping centres, a bit of repurposing of those shopping centres, change the demographic, change the drive, change who wants to be there, change the amount of hours that people are working there and getting out into the shopping centre itself. So again, there's going to be these draws and demands from SMEs and corporates, but also we're also working with one landlord at the moment that's taking business parks and turning what was a sterile environment that was always designed to be a standalone product with great car parking, good accessibility. And actually, if you can turn those around and start making them not just about offices, but turning it into maybe a retail destination and an office destination and a bit of leisure, etc., you get the benefits of being able to control the environment you're in, if you're the owner and or operator, and be able to provide more uses and more sites of interest, really, for occupiers, and then therefore they're going to feel more emboldened to work and to live and to make the space their own.
Absolutely. I never thought we'd be mentioning farmyards on the FSA presentation, but there we go. It's all in the paper we'll publish afterwards. Just before I push on, there was a question from Zach Douglas. He was just asking where I got my headset from, and he will find that if you search for the cheapest headset under Amazon, you will find this version. It's very Googleable, Zach, just in case you're wondering. So to the next slide. So we've been surveying operators, looking at our demand data on our own right. But one thing we thought was key was to try and look at corporate occupiers, because a lot of misinformation spread about corporates and their use of flex space and their understanding, but also more broadly, how they think they're going to use space in the future. So there have been comments from JP Morgan, Barclays, Nationwide, Google, Twitter, all slightly misquoted and pulled out of shape over the last 2 or 3 weeks about how all their staff will be home working, no one will use the office, the end of the office as we know it. And when you read the nuance of what's been said within those comments, there's a lot of half-truths and willful misappropriation of that commentary. So we tried to go to source and go to the heads of CRE for some of those organizations to understand how they feel the future of space is going to look. And admittedly, it's early days in lockdown. So 5 key issues were that home working is radically changing the perception of workspace within these businesses, no doubt. So suddenly the C-suite, the CFO, the CEO are looking at a raft of workspace costs. They're seeing their entire teams home working and being out of the office. The managerial hang-ups around home working have been relinquished because suddenly they've realized they can manage their teams. But that does not mean the end of workspace and mean the end of offices as far as these people are concerned. It's simply more options in the market. It simply means now they think a license for them to diversify their portfolios, to look at different options, to take out some cost, to take out some upfront cost of self-delivery, which again would be a real release for our sector in terms of providing them with a solution. But they are having conversations now within those businesses at the highest level, as you would imagine, in facing up to what could be the worst recession we've seen for a century or more. They are going to look at their workspace options as the second or third largest cost in their business. To get there, point 3, they need to look at flexible options. They're all using the language of agility and solutions. They want to find ways out of this. They don't want to sign leases. I wrote a piece in EG last week. There are 4,500 leases up for grabs in the next 6 to 9 months across the UK alone. You look at some of the numbers behind that. A huge number are in London, but there are also many in regional cities across the UK. It would be inconceivable. You'd think that those leases, those conventional leases, would just fall back into renewals, however sweet the landlords make them, as we look to face up to the outcomes of lockdown. Also, for big corporate occupiers, 2 other things have really come to light. Is one, their ability to use BCP resources, so they don't need to have a huge building somewhere in the Shires now purely devoted to BCP. But those that have done, and I know someone at Nomura Bank, for example, the staff voted unfailingly. They much preferred commuting down to Farnham High Street, where they have a big office, than they were in their Canary Wharf commute. And they've already started having the discussion within Nomura as to how to use that space better. Do they want someone to come in and run it? Do they want to change the way the team can isolate themselves during the week? Do they all have to commute that way to London, or can they go out that way to a nicer town, to Will's point, a nice market town? Latterly, technology is the big thing. So much of the technology around workspace already exists. Our ability to use Teams, to use remote working technology, to collaborate, to share information in the cloud is already available, but now it's being used across 99% of the workforce. This has liberated workplace strategy. It's so obvious because we've all used it on and off to do conference calls and so on, but it proves it now works. It doesn't, however, mean that people don't want to see each other face to face. I think that's another conversation altogether. But it is giving CRE teams the license to now look at the way they procure space, look at the type of space they procure, and what they're going to do in the future. So this is where we take a view of corporate occupiers and just the size of their portfolios. We kind of crystallize this because we touched upon it in a previous webinar. But really, the bit that's up for grabs is the gray and the green, whereby outside of the big corporate HQs, these big corporates have so much space and so much space under lease, which is costing them a huge amount of money in terms of maintenance, management, and it's not even particularly desirable space within their portfolio. Much of it, and I generalize, is criminally underutilized. Why? And I think this is the question they are now posing themselves. Why are they using this space and taking on the cost when they could look to third parties to either outsource this, to kill it entirely, to use remote working? I think from now, we'll hopefully for the next 6 months to a year, we'll be seeing CRE teams coming into the market looking for options around this. Slightly off topic, but a good example of third-party engagement was the deal Industrious have just signed in New York, which I saw in the American press today, whereby their investor was running their own flex workspace on their own terms, done so successfully for a couple of years. But they've now just signed a contract for Industrious to come in and run it for them on the basis they simply think they'll do a better job and take out some of the upfront costs from their business. My view, and I think Will agrees, and he'll go into it later, is we will see more and more of this once the value of the third party has been established in the mindset of the corporate occupier. Right, Will?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's key. I think one of the key points here is that what you've got to realise is if corporate real estate attitude is changing and they're wanting flexibility and agility, operators need to do the same, and operators need to appreciate that it's not a one size fits all. And we've always been saying that. I know we've all been saying that, but it's very much about ability to adapt and move and be agile and meet those corporate real estate requirements. Otherwise, your product, no matter how good it is going to have a limited appeal.
Exactly that. Just answering another question, Jonathan Weinbrand's wondering why I'm not sitting down. It's purely because of the angle of the camera, and you'll be able to see the top of my bald head. If I actually sat down, wouldn't be ideal. So it's better for me to stand and try and be eye level with the camera. So thank you, Jonathan, for that feedback. Very, very useful. So this is a bit of an obvious one in terms of why we think that workforce itself is changing. And we put this together a little while ago, and then I just thought, shall I take it out or leave it in? But this is exactly what we're hearing the CRE teams now saying, and not just the progressive CRE teams. This is the guys who've always had commuters coming into central London or central big city locations to report for work every single day. They are now looking at a much broader spectrum of the way they work, where they work, and so on. Google and Twitter have famously now said they will push out all their programmers and allow them to work from home to Christmas and beyond to see how it goes. But they also know that a huge number of those programmers will come back to the office. But again, it's giving them the option to go out of the market and see what they want to do. This is slightly more far-reaching and trying to be more predictive about where we specifically see the future of workspace. Again, based on their surveys that we undertook over the last few weeks. So there have been various names for it. Again, Jonathan Weinbrand's been using work nearer home, which I do like. The way we see a lot of these trends coming together is more of a dispersed workplace or a network of workspace from the corporates. Willis Towers Watson in the US, they were talking about relocating to Long Island and taking a variety of space out there, allowing staff to commute to a number of different locations, but then asking them to come into their central office in Manhattan twice a week. That's what they're looking at right now. So for them, the idea of a dispersed workforce and workspace isn't something they're afraid of anymore. It's something they're actively going to consider and then try to incentivize within their team. The reason why this will be enabled is IT, HR, and the CRE teams are definitely playing together better. From our point of view as a sector, what we really need now to overcome is to reassure IT and HR that the systems are in place, that are secure, the cloud computing is secure enough, that there is enough brand there and enough sense of self for the company that they can overcome their previous reservations about flex space from those departments, because it was the HR and the IT teams, I would argue, that probably had some more of the reservations about flexible workspace than the CRE teams themselves. But that seems to have changed now. Those three different departments within big companies are playing together more nicely, and on a slightly smaller level for mid caps and scale ups. Again, they're looking at these things in totality now and thinking, rather than just this is corporate real estate and this is HR, it's workspace together. How do we create solutions that work better for our workforce? And to that last point, wellness in the workforce, what more can they do now? Every company has been realizing their obligation to look after their teams right now and to provide reassurance to them, to provide interconnectivity. And coming out of this, again, yes, cost reduction will be a huge concern as we come out of what will hopefully be a V-shaped recovery rather than something longer. But I do sincerely believe that companies will retain the kind of wellness agenda and look to their workforce and how they care for them. And part of that will be workspace and the options they can offer to them. So a couple of workspace surveys before we get to stage where Will talks through operating models, but we've been looking at different issues with the with operators that have been a key concern to them. I mean, let's not make any bones about this. It is going to be an incredibly difficult time. So we've been trying to look at demand now and in the future. There does seem to be huge prospects for the sector, positive prospects for the sector, but some industry veterans are right to suggest that there will be a washing out. You know, the tide is going to go out, and quite a few companies will be left there. That's inevitable within the services sector, purely because the issues around cash flow and the fact that a lot of clients will suffer and will inevitably walk away from contracts and so on. So we can't be just overwhelmingly positive. However, the operators we've surveyed so far, things do seem to be holding up. Demand tallies with our demand numbers, whereby they're probably seeing about 65 to 70% of the normal level of inquiries. It's harder to convert them into deals because of the difficulties around virtual viewings. There are clients looking for rent holidays and reduced rates, as we can see here by these numbers, and they're looking for options, but it seems like that it's not insurmountable. They're being worked through, and yes, it causes stress and headaches, but I would put forward the argument that because operators know their clients so well and work so closely with them on the whole, they're much better placed than a lot of other kind of organizations in the services industries to deal with clients who are looking for rent holidays and so on and need a way out. Will, would you have anything to add to that one?
Well, no, I completely agree. I think that's one of the points that's bringing up here. So it's and the major point I can't keep going on about enough. We started off as as serviced offices many years ago, with the emphasis seems to get lost a few years ago on the word service, and I think it's all come back with service and hospitality, and the ability to speak to clients and occupiers about their needs and wants is absolutely key, and for them to understand, for operators to understand how ultimately their occupiers work and occupiers of the future work is going to be key. Exactly.
And so again, I want to make sure that we've got enough time for Will to go into detail around models. So just quickly, if you want to approach Instant around some of this aggregated data, we've been trying to talk to operators across the sector around the processes they're putting into place. Not least, clients are asking questions. How can hygiene preserve our safety in the workforce? Can we get back into the workplace as quickly as possible? There is a lot of different conjecture about what could happen. What we're seeing quite definitively is operators are taking action, and a lot of it, there is increased signage in every single operator we've spoken to. Hand sanitization and other health and safety equipment's being put into place, PPEs being supplied aggressively. Some operators are even stocking up on COVID tests to try and reassure clients. I've heard numerous examples now of thermal imaging being procured, which is really progressive and really probably quite hard to source. There are one-way systems in buildings. I think Landmark had a particularly good visual guide to the way that they're going to have flow around their workplaces, which will be clearly signed so people can get around. There is some talk about removing co-working memberships, but others just simply talking about reducing densities for the time being until we move into another stage of this process. So there's a lot of information out there, but one thing, again, I tried to get home in that opinion piece last week is the sector is agile enough to create solutions and to work hard to create environments that clients want to be in. That is what our sector does well, and that is what the conventional market does not do well. So again, there's a real opportunity for the sector to prove what we're made of, which is tailoring conditions to give option back to clients and customers, and they can decide whether they want to go back into these areas and the way they want desks configured. So Will is going to talk through the next stage of the slides. So these are surveys that we've been running in conjunction with Will, and then it kind of leads to his section around operator models.
Thank you. I think you can see that taking the first slide, I'm going to be talking a bit about the models, the operator models, and how they can get involved, and how they can pitch themselves in the marketplace, etc. Sort of stuff that GKRE do on a day-to-day basis. But if you look at this, for example, I mean, these are a couple of quick examples of what we've been seeing back. Is one of the big points that we initially hit straight away on the back of COVID was the point on the right here was what's really happened to operators that were in the midst of negotiating a deal. And what's really positive about this is that there is only, I think it's about 12 to 13% have actually said that they're walking away from the acquisition or through the from whatever they're doing on leasehold management agreement, whatever else it is, with circa 65% are actually just putting things on hold for the moment, which is, I think it's a good sign for the industry. I appreciate that nobody understood at the time when this first happened how much this was going to affect their business. But these figures actually only came out, I think it was last week, John, wasn't it, in terms of what we had. So these are
exactly
up-to-date figures. People are actually working on this, and you can see that people are renegotiating terms or they're continuing on the original terms, which is great. And I think it's really positive for the sector. But I think if you take the stuff on the left-hand side here in terms of what's happening right now, and this is something that we've had a really good split between of operator opinion. We've got a lot of operators saying to us, look, understandably at this moment in time, we just really want to not hunker down, but we want to concentrate on our existing portfolio, our existing clients and our existing occupiers, and making sure we provide the best possible service and get the most income possible for themselves. And what we have been also seeing is that operators have been saying, there are opportunities out there. Can we make the most of these opportunities? And I think here you can see 72% of people were saying that they'd enter into a joint venture or management agreement as of now in the short term, if it was put in front of them, or we're looking at about 35% that would go work with a white label option with a landlord, with a building owner. So I think these are really positive figures, and I think they put operators in a good light here, that they're not trying to say, it's all doom and gloom and we can't see light at the end of the tunnel. Yes, we appreciate the light may be dim, but I think there's some good opportunities here. I think when we look further afield, when we look at the models of it, we all know the models we're looking at. We're looking at the freehold model, which is, it's still going to be as popular as ever. Where, the ability to adapt and move your product if you're an operator is great. You can actually adapt to the times with rents, etc., workstation rates, room rates, whatever else it is. I think we're going to see a lot more investment into operators from property companies that have freehold interests, but also from external funds as well. So looking at Blackstone with TOG and Brockton with Fora, etc. I think there's going to be a really good RDI REIT with, I'll say, a really good opportunity for operators to start partnering with the freehold model, not necessarily buying themselves, but partnering with freehold owners. I think we're going to see a lot more franchising models. I know IWG will be very keen on those worldwide, and in the UK, they're now doing localized areas in the UK on the franchise model, and VentureX have opened in Chiswick Park from America on their franchise. Traditional leasing it's still down its place. It's definitely out of place. There's always been an emphasis on having sensible, affordable rents, but more so than ever now. But I think what we are going to see is those traditional leases being flipped into sort of more of a quasi profit share or turnover lease. These types of deals have been going on for many years, but I think there's going to be genuine interest from building owners where they can actually understand the lease model. They can get a base rent level if appropriate, but then also this will allow them and the operator to react to market forces, any immediate dips or any highs that are coming along, and not put the operator as the tenant under pressure, at risk of failure, when we're looking at income contraction. So I think it's important to understand that the basis of a partnership arrangement, I think, will start growing. I think the landlords will start understanding that how these models work, and they'll get a certainty of income that they can run their freehold values through or on, but also they can get above market returns in the good times as well. What we are going to see more of, and this is probably one of the biggest threats to operators, are owners starting their own product, and to increase their brand awareness, but also to increase the asset awareness as well. As we all know, this is a steep learning curve, and something that we've been talking about is trying to enforce upon, for a better phrase, onto building owners the ability to do partnership arrangements, partnership JV management agreements. It's already started, in earnest pre-COVID, but I think now we're definitely seeing more of that, and obviously this slide attains to that. Partnerships, one of the questions we did ask was, in the short term, if approached by a property owner, do you think that models of FlexSA Workspace will change going forwards? Only 9% of respondents said that things will stay the same. So they're already out there thinking that actually things will adapt and move. But over 45% said that JV management agreements will either become the norm or become more common. So again, we're already seeing that change of dynamic and aspect from an operator's point of view and building owner's point of view. We're being approached by funds, private owners, etc., to look at more partnership arrangements. I think building owners have got to understand that they're not relinquishing the space. They are, well, relinquishing the space to a third party on this basis, but they're rather partnering for that asset and their portfolio to remain relevant, and also to receive premium returns and be able to match the market as it moves forward. I think the ability to adapt and to be agile and be relevant is more key than ever. And I think owners need to understand that the one thing we're going to see at the back of this, even out of 2008, we didn't see this in the back of the recession there, is that they've never had to provide anything but workspace in terms of floor space, etc. They've never provided any service, never hospitality. Even as I say, in 2008, the flex space market was relatively mature and it didn't really provide any tangible competition to the real estate market, traditional real estate market. And the only thing that owners had to do to compete was to compete against each other. It was a level playing field. They had the differentiators were rent, incentives available, and term. And they were the 3 points. There was no product, there was no hospitality, no service, no anything else on board. But even though the market is still relatively small in terms of flex space, we're looking at between 2 and 7% of market towns. I mean, if you look at a place like Reading, for example, there's stats in there of 300,000 square feet of flex space in town centre and then the fringe. But actually, that makes up only just over 2% of the market. So whilst it's still small, what we are seeing is that tenants are more aware of flex space, as we talked about earlier on, and their ability to demand products and service and demand flex space is going to really drive that. And therefore, the way that tenants find space has changed. The ability to go to an online brokerage and find that is the way that people are going about that. They're not going to their traditional agent and knocking on the door and saying, find me space. What we're also seeing, they're demanding fit out, because cash flow is king. And John alluded to it earlier on, is that actually which SME or corporate real estate company, commercial real estate, is going to look at fit out as being part of their key driver. I think having that as a amortized cost across the board will be key. Providing service, hospitality, maybe community as well. They will all be important factors that when you look at pricing as well and incentives, I think they'll all have their own part to play. I think landlords and owners will need to understand that they've got to provide something more than just a basic fit out and hope that people will come, because demand and sincerity, I think, is going to be one of the key drivers that take things forward. I don't really want to dwell too much more because I could go on forever on it, but I think what we've got to see is that where we are seeing, where we're seeing changes at the moment, where we're seeing operators do their best sort of stuff is by working with owners, working with their own clients, working with with occupiers, and understanding how each one works and what each one wants out of a deal. But I think if we can ensure that the market moving forward is relevant, then I think everybody's well placed to make the move, to make it happen. Sorry.
Excellent.
That makes sense.
No, it did make sense. We're coming in just about on time.
That's what I thought.
I was just going to therefore flick through. I mean, we put the S-curve up last year at the FSA on the basis of where we were at, and at the time it seemed that we were just reaching the crest of the kind of peak of inflated expectations. I mean, I think it's fair to say we're definitely now in the trough of disillusionment. This is probably the hardest market that anyone will have seen in our working careers. But like the S-curve in every single evolving or nascent industry, it inevitably follows this pattern, and there is inevitably growth and consolidation after this period, whereby through the market's demand or through our own supply, we will kind of find a new normal and find a way out of this. One thing we probably haven't said enough about is, post 2008, it was a very difficult market, and in the recession before that for operators of any scale, purely because the SME users at the time walked away from their contracts. A lot of demand dried up and left a lot of people with cash difficulties. At the moment, the employment data in those kind of areas is holding up. Yes, there are smaller companies under pressure. How much longer can they continue under this lockdown? there are a variety of factors which I don't think Will would want to predict either, which may or may not happen over the coming months. What we can see so far, though, from the operators we're speaking to and surveying, is that it's standing up very well, and it has stood up very well in Asia Pac, who've obviously been doing this for a longer period of time than we have, and certainly in the US. It doesn't mean that we'll all see it out, as it were, because more difficult times will come. There will be periods of time when rent needs to be paid and so on, and it will be tough. But it is a different market now than it was before. There are a lot more companies with different models out there, to which Will alludes. So hopefully there is enough ground to be optimistic that as we see out the lockdown and we do return to some degree of business investment and business progress, it will be a positive and fruitful time. Will, anything to add to that before we either move to questions or wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I think, we've covered everything. I think there's going to be a really interesting market ahead, as we all know. I think the ability for operators to adapt their model, appreciate that a lot of people are on models that are historic, and therefore it's going to have a huge impact on their returns. But I think the ability I think operators are so well placed to adapt and react to any legislative or occupational requirements. I think the future is bright, but I think at the moment, obviously, as we well know, it's tough. But I think there can be plenty of opportunities out there, and those operators that can make the most of it and really drive their product forward and have a real focus on what they provide and what they do, I think will sit very well.
So the only other thing I would say is that the paper with all this information, a huge amount of this data, we're all going to publish and circulate soon, as well as, of course, the slides from the day. I can also send a link to find out where you can buy this headset should you want it. And otherwise, Jane is there to, I think, wrap things up.
Thank you very much. And just to pick up on the one question that's come through, and this is sort of last chance for anyone to ask any questions. There's a question from Zoe Ellis-Moore, who's actually from our newest member of the Flexible Space Association, Spaces to Places. And Zoe asked, the corporate property investment market is talking about a price discovery period. Do you think that there will be a price discovery period for the flex space market?
If I knew what it was, I'd be all over it. No, I didn't see the Oxford Properties bits and pieces, but I think when we talk about, I think in terms of where we're going to sit in terms of pricing on all sorts of aspects of real estate, I think there's going to be obviously a dip, but I think there's going to be a lot quicker recovery in the sector that we're working in, because it can adapt and react quicker than anywhere else. And I think building owners are very much left outside of that window. They hear anecdotally what's going on. They don't necessarily see it happening on the ground on a daily basis. So I think it'll be interesting to see what eventually comes out the back end.
One way of maybe answering this, but not answering it at the same time, is I've heard or read about a lot of retail landlords, and will potentially retail landlords be indexing rent against footfall and consumer demand, and therefore providing a more realistic rent, right? Which, wow, if such a thing existed, that would be a lot fairer, and it may arguably be one of the only ways to save the high street, such as it is now, being decimated in the UK and almost every global market, in fact. And it does inevitably lead to something which I don't think it's been written about enough, but surely will be, that if there is the clear out of the high street and a clear out of retail space, what comes in its place? So will there be different ways of working in service-based experiential spaces on the high street? Will a series of progressive operators, or many, many operators, move into that space and provide hybrid space that allows people from different companies to work in there? Because if we're going to lose as much as 30% of the high street, as has been predicted, maybe more, something has to be done with it, and it won't just be residential. If there's more demand to live and work closer to home and avoid commuting, it seems a natural fit, and something I've heard from a couple of landlords I've interviewed. So that would be an interesting theme for further thought.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you, John and Will. I think that's been another really interesting webinar. And again, as with our one earlier today, lots of food for thought, and clearly lots of opportunities to take for people that are in the sector. But it's definitely a changing world, and the next few months, and I'm guessing years, are going to be unpredictable to an extent, but it's really good to have the data and thoughts that allow people to plan for what their business can do and to be able to take the opportunities that there are. So our next Flexible Space Association webinar is on Thursday, the 28th of May at 2 p.m. on the increasing importance of data and technology to flex space operators. And we'll be hearing from Adam Blasky of Productive, Peter Anderson of the Office Group, and Miro Mislavov of Office R&D. And we'll send details out within the next couple of days on how to book. So for now, I said before, what should have been our conference day, but look forward to seeing everybody in person there next year. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Jane.